I cut off my freeloading sister, but she stole my identity. For years, I played the role of the family bank, except this wasn't a joke. It was my reality. My sister, Melissa, relied on me for everything: rent, electricity, groceries, even occasional treats for her daughter, Ellie. Meanwhile, I worked overtime at my blue-collar job, sacrificing my own needs just to keep her afloat. Melissa wasn't always like this. There was a time when she had stability, a husband, a household she could manage. But when her temper drove him away, she was left with bills piling up and a child to raise. That's when responsibility was forced onto me. Our parents, enjoying their retirement, made it clear they weren't stepping in. "You're young, John. You'll figure it out," Mom had told me. So I did. I picked up extra shifts, tightened my budget, and put my own aspirations aside. Also, Melissa and Ellie wouldn't go without. I convinced myself that helping them was the right thing to do. But things changed. A year ago, Melissa landed a solid job. Not glamorous, but steady, with a paycheck and benefits. I told myself I'd help a little longer, until she got settled. Yet as time passed, I noticed something disturbing. Melissa wasn't struggling anymore. She had money, but instead of using it to stand on her own feet, she indulged herself. At family gatherings, she'd casually mention her latest shopping spree, the fancy gadgets she bought for Ellie. At first, I let it slide. Maybe she deserved a bit of joy after her hardships. Then, last week, she pushed me too far. We were having dinner at our parents' house: Melissa, Ellie, Mom, Dad, and Uncle Rob. As usual, Mom and Dad bragged about their latest cruise while Ellie refused to eat her vegetables. Then Melissa dropped a bombshell. "I found this gorgeous designer bag," she said, flashing her phone. "It's only $500. I stopped mid-bite, trying to process her words. "You're thinking of spending $500 on a purse while I'm still covering your rent?" I asked, my voice controlled but firm. She laughed. "Oh, don't be so cheap, John." Something inside me snapped. 5 years of sacrifice, postponed vacations, missed nights out, dreams put on hold, all for her. And now I was cheap? I set my fork down. My appetite disappeared. "Cheap?" I echoed, my voice like ice. "Let's talk about cheap, Melissa. Like how I've been paying your rent while you spend freely. Or how I gave up everything while you acted like you were struggling. You know what? I'm done." The room fell silent. Mom and Dad suddenly found their mashed potatoes fascinating. Melissa blinked at me, stunned. "What do you mean, done?" she asked, her voice unsure. "I mean no more rent, no more groceries, no more handouts," I said, standing up. "You're on your own." Uncle Rob leaned back, letting out a low whistle. "Good for you, John," he said, clapping me on the back. "You don't owe anyone anything." Melissa stammered, trying to come up with a response, but I didn't wait. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door. I paused just long enough to say, "And if you think I'll change my mind, don't. It's time for you to grow up, Melissa." I left with my heart pounding. Driving home, a mix of relief and rage battled inside me. 5 years as her personal ATM, and this was my reward? I thought that was the end of it. I had no idea it was just the beginning. Melissa's silence was unnerving. No calls, no texts, no guilt-tripping messages. Days passed. A week. It felt too quiet, like the calm before a storm. And then the storm hit. Late one night, a knock echoed through my apartment. I opened the door, not expecting to see my parents standing there, their expressions a mix of anger and self-righteous disappointment. "We need to talk about Melissa," Mom announced, stepping inside as if invited. Dad followed, shutting the door behind him. I leaned against the kitchen counter, crossing my arms. "Do we? Because I think I've already said everything that needed saying." "She's struggling, John," Dad said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Ellie shouldn't suffer because of your stubbornness." I let out a dry chuckle, but not out of amusement. "Let me get this straight. You two, who have spent the last 5 years traveling and enjoying wine tastings, now want to lecture me on family responsibility? When exactly did you decide to care?" Mom's face turned red. "That's not fair," she snapped. "Oh, it's completely fair," I shot back. "You retired? I get it. But somehow, your daughter became my problem the moment you decided you didn't want to deal with her." Mom launched into another rant about family loyalty. Dad sighed dramatically, shaking his head as if I were the disappointment in this situation. "You're being heartless, John," Mom finally said, her voice dripping with disappointment. "This isn't like you." "Maybe not," I replied, walking to the door and pulling it open, "but this is who I am now. Thanks for stopping by." They left, muttering under their breath. But for the first time in a long while, I felt free. I had finally stood my ground. That feeling lasted exactly 2 days. Melissa called me out of nowhere. At first I debated ignoring it, but curiosity got the better of me. "What do you want?" I asked, skipping the pleasantries. Her voice was surprisingly cheerful. Just wanted to let you know I'm moving out of my apartment next month, I frowned. Why? Can't afford it without me? Oh, I can afford it, she said smugly. I just don't want to. Mom and Dad offered to let me move back in. The words hit like a punch to the gut. What? Yeah, they didn't want Ellie to suffer because of your little temper tantrum, she said, sounding entirely unbothered. So I'm packing up and moving into the guest room. Should be cozy. I clenched my jaw. The thought of Melissa lounging at my parents' house rent-free while they continued making excuses for her was almost too much to process, but she wasn't done. Oh, and one more thing, she added, her tone laced with fake sweetness. You might want to check your credit report. Just a heads up. A chill ran through me. What the hell does that mean? She laughed. You'll find out. Bye, Johnny. I hung up and immediately pulled up my credit card account. My stomach dropped. There it was. A brand new credit card in my name, maxed out with thousands of dollars in purchases from stores I had never even stepped foot in. Melissa hadn't just taken advantage of my kindness. She had stolen my identity. My hands shook as I stared at the screen. A storm of rage, disbelief, and betrayal crashing over me. Helping her had been one thing. Being made a fool of was another. This wasn't just about cutting her off anymore. This was war. For the next 2 weeks, my life was consumed by damage control. Endless calls to credit card companies. Meetings with a lawyer. Filing a police report. Not because I wanted to, but because I had no other choice. Melissa had given me no choice. Then came the next betrayal. I was at work trying to focus when my phone buzzed with a text from Uncle Rob. Did you know your parents took out a loan? Figured you should hear it from me. A cold wave of dread washed over me. A loan for what? I called him immediately. They're paying off Melissa's debt, he said flatly. She went running to them after you cut her off, and they bailed her out. Took out a loan against the house to do it. I gripped my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. You've got to be kidding me. I wish I was, Rob sighed. They didn't want you to find out, but I thought you deserved to know. I hung up, my blood boiling. Not only had they enabled Melissa again, but they had put their own financial stability on the line for her. And when everything inevitably fell apart, they'd expect me to pick up the pieces. That night, I drove straight to my parents' house. When I walked in, they were sitting with Melissa laughing as if everything was fine. But the moment they saw me, the mood shifted. John, Mom said cautiously, what are you doing here? I didn't bother with pleasantries. I just found out about the loan, I said, barely containing my anger. Care to explain? Mom paled, but Dad stood up, his expression firm. We did what we had to do, he said, his voice unwavering. Ellie shouldn't suffer because you're being stubborn. I turned to Melissa, my fists clenching. And what about you? What's your excuse this time? Was stealing my identity not enough? Melissa folded her arms, her face defiant. I did what I had to do, John. You cut me off. What was I supposed to do? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. You were supposed to grow up, I snapped. But instead, you ran back here and dragged them down with you. I turned to my parents. So let me get this straight. You two, who have spent the last 5 years traveling and sipping wine, are now here to lecture me on family responsibility? When exactly did you start caring? Mom's face flushed red. That's not fair, she snapped. Oh, it's completely fair, I shot back. You retired and suddenly your daughter became my problem because you decided you didn't want to deal with her anymore. We're protecting our family, Mom insisted, her voice firm. No, I corrected. You're enabling her, and I'm done being a part of it. As I turned to leave, Dad's voice thundered through the room. Don't you dare walk out on this family. I paused, my pulse pounding in my ears. I turned back to face them all. You already walked out on me the moment you decided my sacrifices didn't matter. I've been your scapegoat long enough. From now on, you clean up your own messes. Melissa smirked, arms crossed. You'll be back, John. You always come back. I met her gaze with a steady, unshaken voice. Not this time. I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. That night, my phone buzzed nonstop. A flood of angry texts from my parents. Passive-aggressive messages from Melissa. I ignored them all. For the first time in years, I wasn't shackled by their expectations. I wasn't their financial crutch, their fixer, their fool. I was free. This wasn't rebellion. It was liberation, and I had no intention of going back. The fallout was immediate. Within hours, the family group chat exploded. John, you're tearing this family apart. You were raised better than this. Ellie is heartbroken. You're a selfish coward. I put my phone down, clenched my jaw, and went for a walk. The night air was cool, peaceful, the exact opposite of the chaos I had just walked away from. My emotions clashed inside me. Anger, sadness, relief. For years, I had carried the weight of my family's expectations. Now that I had let go, I wasn't sure what to do with myself. The next day, I got an unexpected call from Uncle Rob. Heard about what happened, he said, his voice firm. Good for you, kid. Someone needed to stand up to them. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. Thanks, Rob. I don't feel like the hero right now. You're not the hero, he replied bluntly. You're just the only one with any common sense. His words hit deep. For the first time, I felt a sense of validation. Still, the days that followed followed weren't easy. My parents stopped calling. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was thick with unspoken anger. Melissa wasn't as quiet. She turned to social media, posting cryptic messages designed to guilt-trip me. It's sad when the people who should love you the most are the first to abandon you. And my personal favorite, family, is forever, unless they decide you're inconvenient. But the real breaking point came a week later. My parents invited me to dinner. Against my better judgment, I went. A part of me still hoped for some kind of reconciliation. When I walked in, the air was tense. Melissa was already there, seated at the table with a smug expression. Ellie was nowhere in sight. "We need to talk," Dad said, his voice low and serious. "You mean about how I'm the villain now?" I asked, sitting down. "About how you handled this," Mom corrected sharply. "You didn't have to humiliate Melissa or threaten her with the police." I scoffed. "She committed fraud. What did you expect me to do? Applaud her?" Dad's jaw tightened. "You could have handled it privately. You didn't have to escalate things." "Privately?" I repeated, shaking my head. "You mean quietly, so no one would see how you've been enabling her for years?" Melissa finally spoke up, her voice filled with bitterness. "You're just mad because I don't need you anymore." I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. "You never needed me, Melissa. You just used me. And now you've dragged them down with you." Mom's expression softened, her voice pleading. "John, please, for Ellie's sake." I clenched my jaw. "This isn't about Ellie. This is about you refusing to let her deal with the consequences of her actions. And I'm done being a part of it." I walked out without looking back. That night I sat on my couch, replaying the conversation in my head. The anger, the betrayal, the hurt. But underneath all of that, there was something else. Something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. In the weeks that followed, I focused on my life. I went back to the gym, reconnected with old friends, threw myself into work. Uncle Rob and I had dinner one night. He raised his glass and nodded approvingly. "You're finally living for yourself," he said. "About damn time." And for the first time in a long while, I truly believed it. It wasn't easy. The guilt lingered, especially when Ellie called one evening. Her voice was small, uncertain. "Uncle John, why don't you come around anymore?" I swallowed the lump in my throat. "I love you, Ellie. I always will," I told her, my voice gentle but firm. "No matter what happens, I'll always be here for you." But my decision stood. I had learned a painful truth. Being family didn't mean sacrificing my happiness, boundaries, or dignity. Sometimes the deepest act of love was knowing when to step away. And as the days turned into weeks, something incredible happened. I found peace. The silence from my parents and Melissa was deafening at first. For years, I had been their safety net. The fixer, the provider, the one they called when they needed money or a problem solved. Now, there were no calls. No demands. At first it felt strange. Then it felt like freedom. With no one draining me emotionally or financially, I started filling my time with things that made me happy. I finally joined that recreational basketball league I'd been putting off for years. I took a weekend trip to the mountains, something I had postponed so many times it had felt like a distant dream. Standing by a quiet lake with no one texting me about overdue bills or guilt-tripping me into fixing their problems, I felt something I hadn't in years. Relief, freedom, work became a source of pride again. Without the weight of family drama looming over me, I focused on a new project, poured my energy into it, and within 3 months, earned a promotion. Even my coworkers noticed the difference. "You seem lighter," one of them said over lunch, "like you're finally breathing." They were right. For the first time in years, I could breathe. Uncle Rob remained a steady presence in my life. One night over dinner, he raised his glass. "Here's to you, kid, for finally learning how to say no." I laughed, but his words stuck with me. Saying no had been the hardest thing I had ever done, but it was also the most important. Melissa, of course, continued playing the victim. From what I heard, she was still living at my parents' house, avoiding responsibility, making excuses. Mom and Dad had grown increasingly frustrated, but their pride wouldn't let them admit they had made a mistake. They had enabled her for so long that they were now trapped in the mess they had helped create. The real surprise came from Ellie. One afternoon, she called me from her mother's phone. "Uncle John," she whispered, "can I come visit you? Mom says you're mad at us, but I miss you." Hearing her voice made my heart ache, but it also gave me hope. "Of course you can visit," I told her warmly. "You're always welcome here." That weekend, she came over. We spent the day baking cookies, watching movies, and talking about school. As she hugged me goodbye, she whispered, "Thanks for being my favorite uncle." And in that moment, I knew exactly why I had fought so hard to set boundaries. It wasn't just for me. I wanted Ellie to see what self-respect looked like. The lesson I learned was simple but powerful. Standing up for yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary. Family isn't about blind obligation. It's about respect, support, and mutual care. And when those things are missing, it's okay to walk away. The distance from my family was hard, but it gave me something even greater, the chance to build a life I could be proud of. I wasn't wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving, and for the first time in years I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. One evening, as I stood on my balcony watching the sunset, I realized something important. I hadn't lost a family. I had found myself, and that was a trade I'd make again in a heartbeat. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking real-life stories like this. See you in the next one.